Black Aggie, I killed your baby. Black Aggie, I killed your baby. Black Aggie, I killed... I thought you were... well, you know what? I'm glad you're here. We got a lot to talk about. As children, most of us learn our local lore and urban legends through stories told to us by friends, family, and other social agents. Telling tall tales and scary stories around the campfire is an age-old tradition, and we all had our version of the boogeyman, who was usually relative to where we grew up, unless your boogeyman was a more ubiquitous character like Dracula or Freddy Krueger. But to me, the boogeymen that weren't already iconic movie monsters were always much scarier, and more likely to actually exist. All around the world, some variant of the boogeyman story has been passed down from generation to generation. For instance, in Latin America they tell tales of El Hombre del Saco, which loosely translates to the sack man, who gets his name from allegedly stealing children and stuffing them into his sack. In Spain, they have El Coco, who some frustrated parents use as a sleep aid by telling their children, if you don't go to sleep, El Coco will come and get you. In Iceland, it's Grilla, the festive troll that ruins Christmas for some families by eating their naughty children the night before. And of course, there's the Jersey Devil, the Slender Man, Bloody Mary, Krampus, and the list goes on. My boogeyman, or in this case, boogie woman, was Black Aggie, and she scared the shit out of me. No lie, I actually saw old Black Aggie in my room one night, but I'll get to that part of the story a little later. My deep, irrational fear of Black Aggie began to manifest in my senior year of high school. Just kidding, I never really went to high school. It was actually around 2nd or 3rd grade when I had first heard of the infamous old hag. I had overheard some of my classmates daring each other to shut themselves in the bathroom with the lights out and recite the incantation, Black Aggie, I killed your baby. According to my creepy classmates, repeating this gruesome admission 10 times while looking in the mirror, by yourself in the dark of course, would invoke the ghost of Black Aggie, who may or may not respond in kind by killing you. Being a bit of a thrill-seeker in my prepubescent years, I took my turn in the dark bathroom, confessing to infanticide. But alas, sorry to disappoint, Black Aggie did not show her scary face, and I lived to see another day. However, the tale of this spooky lady left a lasting impression on me.
There's a girl in the heart of Maryland, with a heart that belongs to me.
Now, if you're not from the Baltimore, Maryland area, you probably have no clue who this Black Aggie character is, and why children in that neck of the woods are so creeped out by her. Well, I'm going to tell you. To the best of my memory, of course, as it was told to me. The story goes that Aggie was a reclusive old woman who lived alone deep in the woods somewhere in southern Maryland some time ago. Perhaps in a time when wild women who lived alone in the woods were often accused of being witches, and Aggie was no exception. You see, the townsfolk who had already thought Aggie was more than a bit weird were shocked when they saw that the witchy old woman had suddenly and mysteriously become plump with child. Being that Aggie was known to be very reclusive and a lifelong spinster, her unexplainable pregnancy raised more than a few eyebrows among the townsfolk. And when Aggie eventually gave birth, the superstitious townies were horrified to discover that the child had been born with what appeared to be small nub-like horns on its head and cloven, hoof-like feet. Convinced that Aggie's baby must have been spawned from Satan's seed, the delusional townsfolk snatched the malformed infant away from her and proceeded to drown it in a watering trough. As might be expected, Aggie was devastated by the senseless murder of her newborn and swore vengeance on the town and its people. And a short time later, townsfolk who ventured out into the woods surrounding their village began to turn up missing and would later be found dead and horribly mutilated. With the memory of Aggie's threats of vengeance still fresh in their mind, the townsfolk were swift to blame her for the grisly murders. Seeking a bit of vengeance themselves, an angry mob of townies converged upon Aggie's shack in the woods and burned it to the ground with her in it. As the shack burned, some of the townsfolk could hear Aggie still screaming for vengeance for her murdered child. But wait, there's more. You see, legend has it that the ground on which the misfortunate Aggie was burned alive remains blackened until this day, and many believe it to be cursed earth. In fact, there have been several unexplained deaths that have occurred in and around the area in which Aggie was said to have lived and died. One account is that of a troop of Boy Scouts who had camped overnight near Aggie's blackened gravesite. Apparently, one of the scouts had strayed from camp to take a whiz or possibly investigate the infamous black spot, and had been found the next day lying dead and disemboweled on that very spot. Now I know what you're thinking. This story is as ridiculous as it is unbelievable. But to an 8-year-old, this fractured fairy tale read like the evening news. Yep, I was a believer. And I was pretty sure that old Black Aggie was going to get me, whether I killed her baby or not. Suffice it to say, I obsessed about Black Aggie for the rest of the school year and into that summer. That summer was one of the few summers that I spent visiting my grandparents in Tennessee. These were my granny and pawpaw on my dad's side, and if you know anything about my dad, you can imagine the dysfunction that must have existed in that household. Now, old Granny was a domineering figure in her house and a bit eccentric to say the least, and she loved to tell a tall tale. For instance, she told me once with no uncertainty that my grandfather from New Jersey was in the Italian Mafia. Which, if you knew my mild-mannered, good-hearted papa from New Jersey, you'd understand how absurd her accusations were. There's also the creepy story she told me about the finger-shaped rock that she had found and set on her kitchen windowsill, and how that old finger rock would occasionally curl up as if beckoning to her to come hither. Now, don't get me wrong, I loved old Granny and she could be a lot of fun, and I always found her silly stories to be quite compelling. But at the same time, some of her stories really creeped me out, and I think she enjoyed that. So it probably comes as no surprise that when I confided in her in regards to my fear of Black Aggie, she had a field day teasing me about it.
No!
One of the first things she did was tell me that she knew Black Aggie's sister, Black Maggie, and that Maggie lived in the cedar chest in the guest room where I slept. Old Granny continued to taunt and tease me about Black Aggie all that summer, but her piece de resistance was the night she turned out all the lights, pulled a pair of pantyhose over her head, and proceeded to run around cackling and proclaiming that she was Black Aggie.
I'm Black Aggie.
I had become rather used to Granny's antics by then, so I put on a brave face, picked up a book, and pretended to read it, in the dark, while Granny continued to cackle and do her best Black Aggie impersonation. Afterward, I think I remember her saying something about how brave I was during her performance, and that had made me feel somewhat vindicated of my earlier cowardice. But looking back on the incident now, the whole thing seems a little kooky, if not downright batshit crazy. From a therapeutic perspective, Granny's Black Aggie roleplay did somewhat resemble a form of intensive exposure therapy called flooding, which is used primarily to treat anxiety and phobias. Therapists using the flooding technique subject the client to direct exposure of their specific phobia without quarter until the client's natural fight-or-flight response becomes exhausted and their fear subsides. In other words, they scare you into not being scared. Although there has been limited research on flooding over the years, it has in some cases been known to work. However, in the wrong hands, flooding can have the opposite effect and actually increase a person's level of anxiety and cause further trauma. So if you're considering exposure therapy for a particular phobia, I recommend systematic desensitization, which is a more gradual, laid-back form of exposure therapy. Granny's Black Aggie games may have been well-intentioned, but she was certainly unqualified to practice any type of therapy, especially one as potentially harmful as flooding. The fact of the matter is, she probably did more harm than good when it came to my fear of Aggie, and also likely increased my distrust of adults in general. My fear of Black Aggie persisted and grew stronger. I was having recurring nightmares about her and feared going to sleep at night. In one of the nightmares, I was holding hands with my grandmother in New Jersey, who I loved dearly, and it was a happy dream until I looked up at her face and saw that she had turned into Black Aggie as a malevolent pitch-black silhouette with glowing red eyes. Another time, I dreamed that I was sitting on my bedroom floor playing with my Star Wars toys, and my mother had walked in, but when I looked up at her, it was not my mother, but you know who. Yeah, Black Aggie. However, this time when I awoke from the dream and opened my eyes, I saw that the Black Aggie mom morph was still standing there in my room staring at me. I closed my eyes and shook my head several times to make it go away, but every time I opened my eyes she was still standing there. So I finally gave up, pulled the covers over my head, and laid there curled up shivering until I fell back asleep. Of course, I did have chickenpox at the time and a very high fever, so that might explain away the hallucination. But but at the time, the wraith in my room seemed very real. Interestingly though, Granny did in fact rather inadvertently help me to eventually conquer my fear of Black Aggie. You see, there was one other thing that Granny liked even more than telling her tall tales, and that was talking about God and the Bible. Granny talked to me about God quite a bit, and told me that God would protect me against evil if I asked him to. So I did just that. In fact, I introduced God and Black Aggie to each other, and suggested that they become friends. Call it divine intervention or simply your common everyday placebo effect, but either way, it worked. My Black Aggie nightmares stopped, and my fear subsided. And I'm happy to report that I still have absolutely no fear of Black Aggie, nor her sister. In fact, I looked her up online some years ago, and it turns out that the whole Black Aggie myth was inspired by a memorial statue in a cemetery in Pikesville, Maryland, not too far from where I grew up. A statue. That was the origin of my childhood nightmares and overwhelming fear of Black Aggie. And it's not even the original statue. It's actually a replica of the original, which was sculpted sometime in the late 19th century. The statue, that some refer to as Grief, was said to have been commissioned by the grandson of President John Quincy Adams as a memorial for his late wife, who had reportedly committed suicide. Years later, an unauthorized replica of the statue was erected and placed upon the grave of General Felix Agnes in Druid Ridge Cemetery. Agnes, Aggie, Agnes. Okay, now we see where the name Aggie comes from. And looking at these photos I found online of the old girl, you can see how some might consider her to be a blackish hue. In my opinion, she's more of an Oxford grey color. But of course, black sounds a bit more sinister. I mean, come on. Who would be afraid of Oxford grey Aggie? Apparently, there have been many myths and legends swirling around the Black Aggie statue since its placement in Pikesville nearly a century ago. But none of the lore I read online resembled that closely the story I was told as a kid. Most of the folklore seemed to pertain more to the statue itself than the ghost of a vengeful old witch. For instance, it is said that anyone who sits on Aggie's unyielding lap will be molested by restless spirits or experience some other sudden misfortune. There have also been accounts of people seeing the Aggie statue's eyes glow red and move its arms and head. Just like my grandmom's eyes glowed red in that nightmare I had as a kid. Perhaps the glowing red eyes were part of the story my classmates had told me. I just don't remember. Well, anyways, long story short, there's no such thing as Black Aggie. It's just a creepy statue that creeps people out. I mean, come on, you think I'm still afraid of Black Aggie at my age? Many times, the things that scare us the most are not so scary when we are able to put them into perspective and see them as they truly are and not as the monsters we've made them into in our minds. Of course, there do exist real boogeymen in the world, and they are the only monsters that we really need to be wary of.